Hi, it's Tom here. Welcome to FTS Quad Ventures, and today we are going to be looking at the first part of my All the Gear No Idea series. And I did say I would produce some gear stuff. Today we're going to be looking at radios. We're going to be specifically looking at transmitters, and I'm going to run you through what I think about this stuff and what I've learned while I've been doing this in the last 6 to 8 months. And now I started, same as you, as a complete new person to RC in the 21st century. I'd had a lot of stuff back in the 80s and 90s, but when I came in, I was horrified to discover that there is no standard protocol for radios. It's madness. Every manufacturer has their own protocol. Every manufacturer's stuff is different, and some manufacturers have more than one protocol, and none of them are compatible with each other often. And you can't use a Horizon hobby plane with just a cheap £50 FlySky transmitter. You have to buy DSMX or something like that. And the same with Taranis. You know, you can't use a nice, neat little FreeSky receiver with a handset you already own. So I'm going to go through the minefield, and we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up. So the first one we're going to look at is one of these, which is this is the Horizon Hobby E-Flite Batwing. And this is here to represent the kind of transmitters that you will get in a kind of ready-to-fly package. And a lot of people start with those, and you get them with varying degrees of cheapness, from everything in toy quads right the way up to larger aircraft. You may find that you get something similar to this included in your package. Now, there's nothing wrong with these. They're very good for what they do, and they're designed to get you flying quickly. But bear in mind that this, even though it uses DSMX, you can't bind this to other receivers. So one of these, once you've got it, is really only good for the plane that you got it with, or a similar plane. So this might bind to other UMX aircraft, but for example, it wouldn't bind to just a generic DSMX receiver. So those have limits, and also you can't set your own settings on these. Obviously, they come how they come, and the computer programming of the like SAFE or AS3X or whatever is in your plane is going to be there. And also you have no expo on the sticks and no rates changes or anything like that. So just bear that in mind, very limiting, but obviously will get you flying. That brings us up to kind of the next radio in the line. This is the ORX TX6i. This is the second edition one from Hobby King, and I bought this because it's a DSMX radio, and I had the Hobby King, I had the Horizon Hobby Carbon Cub S when I bought this TX, and I wanted a TX that would interface with that, and I thought I might buy some more Horizon Hobby products, and I didn't know about multi-protocol modules and things at that point. And this was very cheap second hand, and I got a good deal on it, and it's been flying all my foamies, all my fixed wing has been on this since, and it's been a really good transmitter. So I'm going to use this one to represent a whole class of transmitters, starting pretty much with the FlySky FS6i, and going right the way up to some of the kind of entry-level DX6E Spectrum products. In that, within those systems, the programming is limited in terms of what you can and can't do. Like, some of these have fixed mixes, they have a fixed number of mixes, not all of them. Obviously the more expensive Spectrum products offer a wider range of things. They have voice alerts and they have a load of other stuff. This one doesn't have voice alerts, it usually has beepers, and you can see I've put covers on the switches so I can just, without telling and looking down at my TX when I'm watching my aircraft, I can see which switches I need to operate to do different things. Now, the beauty of these, of course, is that because they're a fixed programming system, it's relatively easy to learn. It took me an evening to learn how to program this, and it took me about 2 hours to get AS3X and all the safe modes and the flight modes working on my Carbon Cub S, because it was fairly intuitive and fairly simple. I can say that I've had no troubles with this binding, and it's had superb range. I've had right out to the edge of the UK 500 meters with my planes, to the point where I can barely see the damn thing. This has been rock solid, and I've never had any problems with it. So there's nothing wrong with those cheaper transmitters. Obviously they will skimp on the gimbals a little bit. I quite like the gimbals on this one. They're quite good. I felt they were better. They were certainly better than the toy ones, and they're nice and big, and they allow you to pinch or thumb, which is good. And the kind of archetypal version of these is the FlySky FS6i or derivatives, which are the most common ones, and those can be had for under 60 quid. You can fly quads on those, and you can also expand them to be 10 channels, which is pretty good. Most of these are locked, so this is 6 channels, and then you can get them in 9 or 8, or you can get them in 12 channels. So a lot of that is kind of an enclosed system in that there's limited expansion. This one doesn't have a module bay on the back, for example. There are other ones in the Turnigy range that have module bays and stuff, and module bays allow you to do other things. So that's the kind of mid-level radios. Great if you want simplicity. This particular one is really good for fixed wing. It's less good for quads. It's okay, you can fly quads on it. Spectrum don't have great quad support in my opinion with their receivers, but you can fly quads on those. I know some pro pilots fly on Spectrum. The Drib obviously has his DX6 that's very battered, but it's usually in shot, so you can fly quads on those as well. And obviously the entry-level price point of under 60 quid makes a lot of these quite attractive. So that brings us on to the kind of next level of radio. Some people would argue that this is pretty much the same as that orange one, it's just a slightly different system. But what makes this, I think, a proper radio against a kind of more restrictive radio is the fact that it has a module bay. And this is the genius thing about Jumper, is that it includes this amazing 4-in-1 module that basically allows you to run anybody's receiver. You can bind this to pretty much anything you like. It doesn't matter what protocol it's on. This Jumper module has that protocol in it. Now you can get smaller ones that fit inside the module bays and plug in for other radios like the Taranis 9XD. And I'll come on to that in a minute. But this, obviously the Jumper is physically small. There's lots of reviews of the Jumper. I'm not going to bore you with the technical details. If you want to find that out, you can. What bothers me about the Jumper compared to obviously these more fixed systems was the complexity is a whole new level up. It took me, Jumper has lousy documentation at the moment. There's not very much, because they're relatively new to OpenTX, there's not very many setup videos on how to set your Jumper up as opposed to how to set up your Taranis. There is some comparison between the two, but they're not the identical system, and the screens and buttons on this are different to the screens and buttons on that. So be aware that you know, all those great videos on how to set up your 9XD for your quad, they will work on this, but they won't work on this, if you catch my drift, in that you'll look at the screen and you'll be like, oh, that doesn't look the same. And for things like AS3X and SAFE and binding with more complicated bind and fly models, you can bind really well. This binds fine. I've not had any binding issues with it. However, obviously setting up some of those functions into OpenTX is very different from setting them up on a pre-programmed radio. So if you're going to be serious about quads, I feel that OpenTX is still the best option, simply because it's the most supported in terms of videos. So videos on this, again, with that caveat that obviously the screens will be different. You can set up, I've found, once I worked out how to set up this, I was able to work out how to set up this. So the two did cross over. This runs OpenTX 2.2.3 and this one's running 2.2.2. So there was not much difference, it's just the buttons and the screens do look slightly different. Now this is 90, I think we paid 98 quid for this shipped, and it came with hall sensor gimbals, which are much more precise, I feel, a little bit better than the regular potentiometer gimbals, certainly on a radio of comparable price. These were very nice little gimbals, and my son wanted black because he said the cream looked like a toaster. So you are a little limited with Jumper. Obviously you've got your stuff in the top here, you've got your USB, and you've got, I think there's a headphone jack. Oh, that might be the trainer jack, it's the trainer jack on the top. And the beauty of this is that it does everything the 9XD does, but it also allows you to stick it to the EU with the module, because the biggest problem for me with the Taranis, which this gets around so elegantly, is that all models since 2016 have had in the EU have been stuck with D16 firmware. Now the D16 protocol and is loaded on a chip that's separate to the kind of operating system, and the D16 protocol is what flies your plane through the aerial, and you have to buy, if you have a D16 radio, you have to buy EU LBT receivers or flash those receivers with the EU LBT firmware. Now what I discovered was that nearly all the quads from China, if you buy a pre-built, nearly all of those quads that say they're FreeSky compatible come with D8. So thanks to the EU's stupidity, or somebody's stupidity, I'm not saying the EU's there, I'm not getting in a political debate about this, what I'm saying is that this is an extremely stupid thing to have. Thanks to this stupid idea of having this protocol that we can't change, you can't fly all those FreeSky quads on an EU LBT transmitter. unless they're EULBT, and hardly any of the China quads are D16. So you can fly all the receivers if you put your own receiver in, but you can't fly the ones on the board. So that means that like the SP Mini Evo 3 board, the little, all of those kind of micro quad boards that say FreeSky compatible are all D8. So Jumper has got D8 in the multi-protocol module. So you don't have to care about what receiver you buy. You don't have to worry about flashing firmware. You can use any receiver with that. It's got D8, D16, and it's got all the toy protocols and all the other manufacturers' protocols on it as well. So that to me is genius, because it means that you can bind to all the toy quads from China, you can bind to all the pre-builts, it does everything that that does, and a whole lot more. So that, I think, at the moment is probably my pick for an entry level. If you want to get into flying quads for under 100 quid, the T12 is probably your best bet. They have brought out a new model, and I'll come to that in a minute. So that takes us on to the 9XD. Now, obviously, this is a 9XD Plus. The 9XD has been around a long time. It's a very old radio. It's a very well-proven radio. Now, the best thing about this is that it's got amazing support on the internet. There are literally thousands and thousands of videos about setting up. Project Blue Thunder has a great setup video for the Taranis 9X, and Joshua Bardwell obviously has lots of staff. Painless 360 has lots of staff. There are literally tons and tons of videos, and obviously you can customize it quite a bit. Mine's got a few things loaded on it.
Welcome to OpenTX.
Has voice alerts.
Low rates.
And the voice alerts come with it. The T12 you can put voice alerts on as well, but you have to program to do that. It doesn't come with it as standard, and you have to mess about with the firmware to do that a little bit. You've got to load new sound files. Have to do the same on here, and the two ways of doing it are the same. So whatever you can do on this, you can do most of on this, not all, but most. So for example, I've got my rates on here.
High rates. Low rates.
So if I adjust a switch by mistake that actually does something on the quad and I'm in the goggles, it'll tell me. My goggles display will also tell me. And this has got a lot more switches than the T12. And you've got, if you're flying planes, you've got extra dials. There's side and front dials for things like flaps. And it's got a bigger screen. I prefer the buttons to the ones on the T12, and I certainly prefer them to the thumb wheels on some of the other radios. But obviously, this is quite an expensive radio if you buy new. And my advice, if you are going to go down the 9XD route, is to buy a 2015 or earlier 9XD Plus. There's loads secondhand. I paid 120 quid for this with the flight case and everything except the long range module that's in it at the moment. And that also had a really nice charger. It comes with an internal battery pack, which is very good. The internal battery lasts quite a long time. It's nickel metal hydride. It's easy to manage, and you can buy replacements for it relatively easily. And it is quite a nice big radio. I quite like a larger radio. I've got quite big hands. If you've got smaller hands, the T12 actually is as comfortable for big users, but it fits in the palm easier. Just my son has small hands, and he likes that because he finds it more comfortable. It's quite heavy, obviously, when it's all loaded up, but you could put the multi-protocol module into the back of this if you wanted to, but the multi-protocol module is £30, so it kind of adds another chunk to buying your 9XD Plus. You can get a cheaper multi-protocol module that just plugs in, but obviously that won't have D8 on it. Because it's designed for the Taranis, it's not going to have the Taranis' internal module in it, so you can't. That doesn't solve the D8 problem. Which is kind of annoying, but I haven't seen any documentation anywhere that says the cheaper module has D8 on. If anybody knows better, that would be great. Obviously, these are very adjustable. You can change lots of stuff. They're very customizable. You can change nearly everything on them, which is what makes them good. And I bought this because it had such great support, and I saw it, and it was a decent price. So, if you want one model to rule them all, what are you going to buy? Well, you can buy this if you want to be under £100. And that will do everything that this does, apart from a few of the switches. Hasn't obviously got quite as many, but it will do pretty much everything that that does for under 100 quid, which I think is pretty astonishing. And the other thing that Jumper have just brought out in the last couple of months is the Jumper T16. Now the T16 is a full-size transmitter like this one. It's got a bigger screen, it's got a big colour screen, it's got a thumb wheel, which is one of the things that's put me off it, because I don't like those thumb wheels. But the T16 has got Jumper's branch of OpenTX, because they've had a big paddy with FreeSky who've accused them of copying their shtick, and I've had a big lockdown on the firmware. But the jumper version of OpenTX is going to be similar enough that you should be able to follow the videos. And a few people in the community have taken their stuff off of their Tyrannus and put them onto their jumper T16s. I know Bardwell has been flying his T16 a lot. Now there will be probably a T16 Plus with Hall sensor gimbals in the next 12 months. At the moment it comes with standard ball bearing gimbals, but the T16 could be, if you're looking for like a brand new transmitter, it's 130 quid in the UK, which is pretty good. And I don't know whether it comes with an internal battery and charger and other stuff, but you know, a second-hand Tyrannus will stretch you between 70 and 100 quid, with the hard case a bit more. But I think that represents superb value for money. Now, the reason that I think you should buy a proper transmitter to begin with, you can use one of these, and you can use one of these to fly sim, but obviously setting up an OpenTX model to fly sim is a good practice for setting up an OpenTX model to fly a quad. And if you've got the control in OpenTX, it is a lot more complicated. I won't lie, OpenTX is complicated. I'm not very bright and I found it hard going. I'm not brought up on computer programming, I'm kind of a strictly analog guy, and it did take me about 3 weeks to really get my head around how to set stuff up, compared to something like this, which got me flying in 24 hours. So you will have a steeper learning curve. These do work really well on sim. There are videos on how to set up sim models, and Mr. Steele's got a good video on how to set up a sim model on this type of Tyrannus screen, which you could probably look at and still be able to do the same on the T12. So that's my recommendations for radios. If you want your first proper radio, it's a toss-up for me. If you want one rule to rule them all and you're going to buy some pre-made quads and you fly some toy quads, and you want to do a bit of fixed wing, and you might want to do some fixed wing bind and fly, then I would buy the jumper, simply because of that 4-in-1 module and the fact that it does most of what this does, but it has that very versatile module. Or if you're going to just do quads and you want to purely fly quads and you want ease of video setup so that you can watch somebody else do it and you can program it all, which is how I've done a lot of mine, the 9X is still a good radio, and you can get a 2015 9XD Plus, which will allow you to backdate the firmware to include D8 on your transmitter. Like there's two lots of firmware. There's the operating system and the internal transmitter firmware, and if you put the non-EU firmware, which you can get from the FreeSky website, onto your internal transmitter, you then get D8, D16, the long range one, and there was one more that you get included in that, which means you'd be able to use some of the cheap Chinese quads or the mid-range Chinese pre-builts, which are FrSky D8, and you'd still be able to use EU LBT or non-EU LBT, and anything built after 2016, about the middle of 2016, I would say April is probably a sensible cut-off date. So if you've got somebody who says got the original receipt, you can always ask them when the original receipt was, if it's dated 2016. Look for an older one that's at least before that point, because then you can change your firmware. So those are my deals: is buy jumper if you're going to fly quads. If you're going to fly fixed wing and you want kind of entry level, FlySky is really good. The FSI6 is an excellent transmitter. Turnigy do a version of it. It's well supported. You can hack it up to 10 channels. Less good for quads, but possible to fly on quads. But my bet is the jumper at the moment for getting you started.